Hi, Ted Wright from Epic Archaeology. You know, one of the most important questions that people often ask of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is why did God tell the Israelites to kill the Canaanites? It's a very important apologetic question that people find very, very difficult to answer. You know, in a debate, one of the things that we want to do is we want to clarify the terms. And in this video clip that you're about to watch, I explore the archaeology and the history of exactly who the Canaanites are. I hope you enjoy. I want to give you a few verses here for us to think about as we begin to talk about this context. This was in Exodus. Be careful, God says, not to make a treaty with those who live in the land. The Hebrew word is eretz. For when they prostitute themselves before their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you also, Israel, to sacrifice with them and eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their sons, some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves before their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same. They will lead your son to do the same. Do not make a covenant with them, and do not make any of their idols. And then another passage in Exodus chapter 23, do not make a covenant with them or with their gods. Do not invite them to live in the land, or they will cause you to sin against me. How so? Because the worship of their gods will certainly be a snare to you. The warning that God was giving to them is that, listen, when you worship me, you've been in Egypt for 400 years, and you know how the Egyptians worship. They worship Amun-Ra, and they worship Horus, and they worship all these other gods. Well, listen, Israel, I am not like these other gods. That's the whole point. The whole point of God teaching them was that I am not like these gods. I'm unique. There is no other gods before me. In fact, if you look at the Ten Commandments, the first three commandments are commandments about making images, commandments about taking God's name in vain, invoking the name of the Lord. The Lord will not hold him guiltless who misuses his name. So, and then one final one is Judges chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. This is in after the conquest, and now we're entering into the Judges period, and he says here, the angel of the Lord, and many theologians will take this to mean a pre-incarnate Christ, a vision of Christ, and different opinions on that. I tend to hold to that view. The angel of the Lord, the definite article, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you in the land I swore to give to your ancestors. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people. Remember, he said that in Exodus, you shall not make a covenant with the people, but you shall break down their altars, yet you have disobeyed me. You've not done this. I told you to do it, but you didn't do it. So he says, therefore I will not drive them out before you, and they will become traps for you, and their gods will become snares to you. And that's exactly what happened. In fact, after that, they began to say, well, wait a minute, we changed our mind. We're going to go try to do it again. They go to try to conquest again, and they fail, because they failed to drive them out. So we look at what he said, and then we look at what they did. And in between the two things, you can see what God actually meant by looking at what he said and what they actually did, and in the historical record of what we have of what they did. And that's what we're looking at today, is we're looking at what they actually did. And this is something that William F. Albright said years ago in his great book, Archaeology and the Religion of Israel. In dealing with the Canaanites and their religious ideas, we must never forget that Canaanites and Phoenicians were one people so far as language and cultural tradition went. So again, the Phoenicians were later, but they were sort of folded into the people group called the Canaanites and their religion, and they brought that with them. So who are the Canaanites? Let's see, I think double slide there. Yeah. So two sources for Canaanite religion that we learn about, and one source is written records, and the second source is archaeological remains, late Bronze Age administrative text. Two important sites, and we don't have time to get into both of them, but today I'll talk about Ugarit. The second site you may have heard of is called Ebla, the Ebla tablets that found in Syria. Ugarit is also in Syria as well. But the two very important sites for learning about Canaanite culture and religion. And so the first one is called Ugarit, or called Ras Shamra. In 1929, a farmer found a tomb on the Mediterranean coast in Syria. And I've actually seen different dates. Some sources say 1928, one source says 1929. So 1928, 29, somebody found a tomb near the coast. And then later surveys done by the French scholar Claude Schaeffer actually located the actual site of Ugarit, located about 1.5 kilometers inland off the coast of Syria. And then these are the excavators from the 1970s and 80s, 2005 to the present day, excluding the stopping of the excavations because of ISIS, because of the political instability in Syria. It's been excavated by the French for years. And this is actually the front page of the French excavation report, one of the first excavation reports of Ugarit from Claude Schiffer, the French. So what was discovered? In 1970, 120 clay tablets were discovered in Ugaritic language. 1990, 300 more tablets were discovered. And one of the most important things that we learned about from this time period is something called the Baal cycle. We'll talk about that here in just a second. The Baal cycle is one of the most important aspects for understanding Canaanite religion and how it became a snare for the watering down, if you will, of Israel's worship of Yahweh, and how God was trying to show them, I'm not like these other gods. I mean, it was certainly in the context of the ancient Near East, but God is trying to teach them that I'm not like these other gods. Here's a kind of an overview of the archaeological time periods of Ugarit, and I'm just going to move through that. Here's a slide of the actual coastline area called Minit El Beta in Syria. That's where the initial tomb was discovered, and then there's a kind of a map overview of it. So you can see right there on the left the actual coast area, Minit El Beta, and then Ras Shamra is just right there, located a little bit inland. And this is from the excavation report in, I believe, 1930-something. It's just an old map picture. Here is a photograph looking down at the royal palace of Ugarit. And if you'll notice on the very top of the screen there's a road called the Palace Street. So the next picture is going to show what that actually looks like. So if you were standing in Ugarit today, you can look down that main street. So it's very well preserved. And it's a very, very ancient site, center of Canaanite religion and culture. Some more pictures of that. Here's an actual temple of Baal. So a temple of Baal was discovered there. Not only that, we also have Baal himself from Ugarit. This is in the Louvre Museum. Notice, it's very interesting here. Somebody pointed this out to me a couple of weeks ago. The hat. If you know history, especially Egyptian iconography and Egyptian costume and Egyptian crowns, does anybody notice what that crown represents on Baal's head? It's the crown of Upper Egypt. It's the white crown of Upper Egypt. Seems like there was a lot of cross-pollination between Egyptian ideas and Canaanite ideas. You see this cross-fertilization between, because it's understandably geographically, they were cross-pollinating each other in their ideas. Here's a tablet that was discovered. Not only that, but one thing we do, and there's just so much here to talk about. In the Ugaritic and the Canaanite culture, one of the things that they had some bad things that they gave Israel, but one of the good things that came out of their culture was they gave us language and the alphabet. And the phonetic alphabet, the phonetic Punic alphabet came from Ugarit. In fact, a lot of the words, in fact, even some of the Hebrew words, many of the Hebrew words in the Old Testament and the Torah come from the Ugarit language. And there's a lot of cognate words from that. So the Canaanite pantheon. What was their god? The generic Canaanite word for God was originally Elum, which later became El, the strong or powerful one. And William F. Albright says this. He says, the sense of poetic expressions is undoubtedly that El was believed to dwell in a cosmic paradise, just as the Babylonian flood hero is translated to the source of the two rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates. In Genesis, the Garden of Eden is also situated as a source of four great rivers. To this remote spot, the gods invariably had to travel when they wished to consult him. And El was called the father of years and the father of man. He was also called the father bull, the progenitor of the gods, tacitly likened to a bull in the midst of a herd of cows and calves. So El, again, a generic word for God, the way the Canaanites understood it. So usage is going to be important in understanding how the Israelites used the word El in their religion, in their worship of God. And so here's just a kind of overview here of the Canaanite gods. You had Baal, also called Hadad, was the god of thunder and lightning. You had Yam, the god of the sea. Does that sound familiar? Yam, the Hebrew word Yam means sea. So the Canaanite god Yam is the god of the sea. El, we talked about him earlier, is the patriarchal deity and his spouse. He had a wife or a consort named Asherah, and later in Phoenicia she was called Astarte. Then you had Cathara, Casus, the god of crafts, and then Mot, or Mot, the god of the underworld, the god of death and sterility. So there's this interaction between these gods. And then you had Anat, who is the sister of Baal. So this is the Canaanite pantheon. These are the different gods of Canaanite religion. And we find these gods all throughout Israel. At Tel Megiddo, we found this is actually, I believe, here in Chicago at the Oriental Institute. That's a statue of Baal holding a little fan there. This one is also there, and you can really see the Egyptian crown on Baal's head. It looks exactly like, it kind of looks like a pharaoh, doesn't it? But it's actually Baal. And in scholars that I've read believe that he's actually holding a thunderbolt. He's considered the god of thunder and lightning. So they would pray to him. So it had to do with fertility and growing the crops. Asherah, very interestingly, means happy or upright. The word Asherah appears 40 times in the Hebrew Bible, typically in conjunction with a definite article, the Asherah. So not Asherah. So that's led some people to articulate and wonder, is Asherah, does it represent a goddess or does it represent a type of goddess, Asherah? It may refer to a goddess or a category of goddesses, a type of goddess. There's some good articles on this. So who or what is Asherah? Is it a goddess? Is it a holy place? Is it a sacred shrine? Is it a sacred tree? Is it a sacred pole? Is it a grove of trees? You say, well, why would a goddess be associated with a tree? How is a goddess associated with a tree? And we read about in the Old Testament that God told the Israelites to tear down the Asherah. What do you mean by that? And what were they doing? Well, let's go back to Egypt. This is the Egyptian, what I believe is the Egyptian Asherah, or the Egyptian component of Asherah, called the Lion Lady. This is Kudshu, a knot or a start. Now, let me just, as we get into some of these other slides here, I want to warn you, there's some of them are going to be a little bit graphic. I mean, they're stylized, but they're pretty graphic. Not bad, not pornographic, but just warning you, just so you know. So, because we're talking about fertility, we're talking about being fertile, that kind of thing, and that was the whole thing of the sexual purity, and also for your crops as well. You wanted your crops to grow. You wanted your woman to have children, a lot of children. So in order to do that, you had to sort of go through the motions of trying to get fertility to come about. So she's called the Lion Lady in Egypt. Astarte is, or this Egyptian goddess. And this is interesting. In the tomb of Tutmosis III, you see him actually nursing from a sacred tree with a breast, which is really kind of odd. You say, well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, this is in Mesopotamia, another sacred tree motif. These are two goats looking into a tree, 10th century. This one is in Mesopotamia as well, in Sumer, 3rd millennium BC. So the motif of the sacred tree or sacred grove comes up again and again in ancient Near Eastern iconography and religion. This is in Iraq, in Nimrod, a bearded man grasping a sacred tree. So the idea of the sacred tree comes up again and again. This is a cult stand of El and his Asherah. El and Asherah. This is found in Israel. So on the bottom, when you look, you see her standing between two lions. And in the pubic area, you see, obviously, what it looks like. And again, this is the Asherah symbolism here found in Israel. So that's exactly what they were doing. They were worshiping Baal. Now, whether or not they were covenant Israelites, there's no way to know. But these are found in Israel. They're found in presence when Israel was in the land at that time. In Ugarit, we found these interesting little amulets here. This is where it gets a little graphic. But if you notice here, it's kind of hard to see. In the pubic area of the female, there is a tree coming up out of the area, which is symbolic of life, fertility. Now you see the connection between the tree and the female fertility. Not only female fertility, but also the fertility of the crops. So it comes back again and again. So we read in Judges, it says the Israelite did what was offensive to Yahweh. They ignored Yahweh, their God, and they worshipped Baalim, the plural of Baal, and Asherot, plural of Asherah, Judges chapter 3, verse 7. 1 Kings 18:19, the prophet Elijah asked Ahab to summon to Mount Carmel 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. So even Asherah had prophets. He summoned them to, and we know what happened there at Mount Carmel, unless it's just metaphorical, unless it just, has a moral story behind it, or it actually happened. 2 Kings 23, Asherah is associated with Baal during the religious reforms of King Josiah, when he ordered the objects made for Baal and Asherah to be removed from the temple and burned. In the Iron Age, which is the period of the Judges and the period leading up to David and Solomon, leading up to Israel going into their captivity, we find, and throughout excavations in Israel, we find one of the most common things that we find in these Iron Age sites is, guess what? Fertility figurines. Asherah, fertility figurines. And so some scholars will say, well, the Israelites, they didn't worship Yahweh. They worshipped Baal and they worshipped Asherah. Well, yeah, duh. That's what the Bible says. And they were wrong for doing it. And they were condemned for doing it. And they were driven out of the land. And one of the most well-attested archaeological things in the Old Testament is the captivity of the Israelites by the Assyrians first, and then by the Babylonians in 586 BC under Nebuchadnezzar. We have the Babylonian record. We also have the archaeological record to back it up. So the reason why was because of the pure worship of Yahweh was diluted by the worship of Asherah, the worship of Baal. Here are some more figurines. Jerusalem, 7th century. So this is during the time of Israel's kings, these fertility goddesses. You can see there. This is in Jerusalem and Lachish. Jerusalem, 8th century, and Lachish, 7th century BC, found in proliferation. One of the most famous ones that many people know about today that kind of raised a thing a few years ago in the archaeological papers. Dr. Bill Deaver from the University of Arizona wrote a paper called "Did Yahweh Have an Asherah?" Did Yahweh, Hebrew, the Israelite God, have a wife, have a consort? And because it actually says this pithos, which is a huge storage jar, has a painting on it. You can see it on the bottom left there. It's, again, graphic. But it's Yahweh and his Asherah. It's Yahweh and his wife. But again, this was condemned by the prophets. This was not something that they should have done, but we find that they actually did it. So again, to go back to kind of review what we said at the very beginning, in Exodus and Judges, drive them out, because if you don't, their gods will be a snare to you. And that's exactly what we find, and that's exactly what they were. They were a snare to the Israelites. So this was part of a conference called the Genocide in Scripture Conference that was conducted by Defenders Media. There were 4 positions on the question of the Canaanite genocide that were presented in the conference. And if you want to watch all of these, you can follow the link listed in the description. The 4 positions were represented by 4 different scholars, Clay Jones, and then Paul Copan, and then Kenton Sparks, and Professor John Walton. Again, one of the lectures that I gave was the question of who exactly were the Canaanites, and what do we see in the archaeological record concerning the Canaanites. So if you want to watch my entire lecture, the rest of it, then please, again, follow the link in the description, and thank you again for watching.